Have you ever felt that you know everything and don't need to learn more? I asked this question as I stood in front of my class. My name is Mrs. Graham, and I have been an English teacher for over 30 years. At 60, I have taught hundreds of students, and I've learned one thing. Pride can stop you from growing. Let me tell you a story about one of my students, Peter. Peter was very smart. He always answered my questions quickly. He was confident, but maybe a little too confident. He once told me, "Mrs. Graham, I don't think I need more English classes. I already know enough." I smiled at him and said, "Peter, we all have more to learn. Even I, your teacher, learn something new every day." But Peter just laughed and said, "Not me, Mrs. Graham. I'm good." A few months later, Peter came to me looking very worried. He told me about a job interview he had. The interviewer asked him to speak in English. Peter started talking, but he forgot some words. His sentences were not clear, and the interviewer didn't understand him. Peter didn't get the job. I was so embarrassed, Peter said to me. "I thought I knew everything, but I was wrong. Can you help me?" Of course, I agreed to help him. But first I said to him, "Peter, you must empty your cup." He looked at me confused. "What do you mean, Mrs. Graham?" I explained, "If your cup is full, you can't pour more tea into it. Your mind is like a cup. If you think you know everything, there's no room for new knowledge. But if you empty your cup, if you say, 'I don't know everything,' you can start learning again." Peter nodded and said, "Okay, Mrs. Graham, my cup is empty now." From that day, Peter worked hard. He asked questions, practiced every day, and accepted his mistakes as part of learning. A year later, he got another job interview. This time, he was ready. He spoke confidently, and he got the job. I tell this story to all my students because it has an important lesson. Don't let pride stop you from learning. Always keep your cup empty. Now, let me ask you again. Have you ever felt that you know everything? If yes, it's time to empty your cup. After telling Peter's story, I looked at the class again. "Now, let me ask you another question," I said. "Have you ever failed at something and wanted to give up?" Some students nodded, while others looked down, as if remembering their own failures. I took a deep breath and began another story. This is the story of Emma, one of my favorite students. Emma was shy and quiet. She didn't speak much in class, but she had big dreams. She wanted to become a tour guide and work with people from all over the world. But there was one problem. Her English was very weak. I smiled as I remembered Emma's first day in my class. She could barely say, "My name is Emma," without making a mistake. But she tried. Oh, how she tried. Emma came to every class, did all her homework, and practiced every evening. But even with all her hard work, she still made many mistakes. One day, after a speaking exercise, she came to me in tears. She said, "Mrs. Graham, I will never be good at English. I want to quit." I put my hand on her shoulder and said, "Emma, let me tell you something. Do you know how babies learn to walk?" She looked at me, surprised. "They fall down." I continued. "They fall again and again. But do they stop? No, they get back up and try again. That's how they learn to walk. And that's how you will learn English. Emma wiped her tears and nodded. Okay, Mrs. Graham, I won't give up. From that day, Emma became even more determined. She practiced speaking in front of a mirror. She wrote down every new word she learned and tried to use it in a sentence. When she made mistakes, she laughed and tried again. After 2 years, I told the class, Emma got her first job as a tour guide. She sent me a postcard from Paris where she was leading a group of tourists. She wrote, Mrs. Graham, thank you for teaching me to keep trying. I didn't give up, and now I am living my dream. I paused for a moment to let the story sink in. The lesson here is simple. Don't give up. Failures are not the end. They are steps on the road to success. Like Emma, you must keep trying, even when it's hard. That's how you grow. I looked at my students and asked, so, will you give up after your first mistake? Or will you keep going like Emma? After sharing Emma's story, I smiled at the class and asked, now, let me ask you something different. How did you learn to speak your first language? The students looked at each other, unsure of what to say. Some shrugged, and one brave student raised his hand. We learned it as children, he said. That's right, I replied. As children, we didn't memorize lists of words. We didn't study grammar rules or worry about making mistakes. We simply listened, copied what we heard, and practiced every day. And you know what? You can learn English the same way. I walked to the board and wrote 3 words in large letters. Listen, repeat, practice. These are the secrets to learning like a child, I said. Let me tell you about my student, Sarah, who used these techniques to become fluent. Sarah came to my class when she was 25 years old. She told me she felt too old to learn a new language. She said, Mrs. Graham, children learn so fast, but I'm not a child anymore. I smiled and told her, Sarah, it's not about age. It's about attitude. If you can learn like a child, you can learn anything. Sarah looked confused. What do you mean, Mrs. Graham? She asked. I explained. Children don't worry about being perfect. They just try. They listen carefully, they repeat what they hear, and they practice all the time. Adults, on the other hand, are often afraid of making mistakes. But mistakes are how we learn. The first thing I told Sarah to do was listen to English every day. I asked her to watch cartoons in English. Why cartoons? Because the language is simple, the sentences are short, and the voices are expressive. I also told her to listen to English songs and try to sing along. At first, Sarah found it difficult. She didn't understand every word, but I told her, it's okay. Just focus on the sounds and the rhythm of the language. Your brain is like a sponge. It will absorb more than you think. Next, I taught Sarah to repeat what she heard. I told her, when you watch a movie or listen to a podcast, pause after every sentence and say it out loud. Copy the way the speaker says it, their tone, their speed, and even their accent. Sarah started doing this every day. She told me it felt strange at first, like she was playing a game. But soon, she noticed something amazing. Her pronunciation improved, and she started speaking more naturally. The last step was practice. I told Sarah to speak English as much as possible, even if she made mistakes. I gave her a simple rule: speak from your heart, not your head. She started small, talking to herself in English at home. Then she joined an English-speaking group in her city. At first she was nervous, but she remembered my advice. Don't worry about mistakes. Just keep talking. One day, Sarah came to class with a big smile. She said, "Mrs. Graham, something amazing happened. I was in a cafe and a tourist asked me for directions. I spoke to him in English and he understood me. It felt so good. I laughed and said, 'I told you, Sarah, you're learning like a child, and it's working.'" Sarah kept using these techniques, and after a year, she was speaking English fluently. She got a job as a travel agent, helping people plan their vacations in English. I turned back to my class and said, "Sarah's story shows us that it's never too late to learn. You just need to have the right attitude. Listen, repeat, and practice like a child. And most importantly, don't be afraid of mistakes. They are your best teachers." After sharing Sarah's story, I looked at my students and asked, "Why do you want to learn English?" One student raised his hand and said, "To get a better job." Another said, "To travel." A third student said, "To make friends around the world." I nodded and said, "These are all wonderful reasons. But let me tell you a secret. English is not just a language. It's a key that opens doors to new opportunities, new experiences, and new connections." I paused and smiled. Let me tell you a story about my student, Aria. He learned this lesson in a way he'll never forget. Aria was from a small town. He dreamed of becoming an engineer and working for an international company. But his English was very basic, and he felt shy speaking it. One day, he told me, "Mrs. Graham, I don't think I can compete with people from big cities who speak perfect English." I said to him, "Aria, English is not about perfection. It's about connection. If you can connect with people, you can achieve anything." Aria didn't believe me at first, but he was willing to try. I gave him a special homework assignment: write letters to imaginary people from different countries. He wrote to an engineer in Germany, a teacher in Japan, and even a chef in Italy. In his letters, he practiced expressing his thoughts and asking questions. I also encouraged him to join online forums where people from around the world discussed engineering topics. At first, he just read the conversations. Then, little by little, he started joining in. One day, Aria came to class with a big smile. He said, "Mrs. Graham, I met a real engineer from Canada online. We started talking about a project he's working on. He even asked me for my ideas. I laughed and said, 'See, Aria, your English doesn't have to be perfect. You just have to use it to share your ideas and connect with others.' This experience gave Aria a new kind of confidence. He started speaking more in class and even helped his classmates practice. Over time, his English improved, and so did his skills as an engineer. 2 years later, Aria got a job at an international company. He emailed me to say, "Mrs. Graham, I'm working on a team with people from 5 different countries. English is our common language, and it's helping me achieve my dream." I smiled as I read his email. Aria had learned that English was more than just a subject in school. It was a tool, a way to connect with the world, and open doors to opportunities he never thought possible. I looked at my students and said, "Aria's story shows us something important. English gives you the power to communicate with the world. It's not about speaking perfectly. It's about using your words to share your ideas, ask questions, and make connections. So don't be afraid to use English. Start small, just like Aria, and see where it takes you." After telling Aria's story, I leaned forward and looked at my students. "Now, let me ask you this. How do you feel when you fail?" One student replied, "It feels bad, like I'm not good enough." Another said, "I feel like giving up." I nodded. That's how most people feel. But failure isn't the end. It's a lesson. If you keep going, even when things seem hard, you'll find success waiting for you. Let me tell you about another student of mine, Maria, who discovered the power of persistence and connection. Maria was a nurse who wanted to work in an international hospital. She needed English for her job, but she struggled with grammar and pronunciation. She often said, "Mrs. Graham, no matter how much I study, I keep making mistakes. Maybe I'm just not good at learning languages." I told her, "Maria, making mistakes means you're learning, but you need to be patient with yourself and keep trying. Persistence is the key to success." Maria wasn't convinced, but she promised to keep going. I gave her small, achievable goals, like learning 5 new medical terms each week or practicing conversations about patient care. One day, Maria told me about a patient from abroad who didn't speak her local language. The patient needed help, but Maria was too scared to speak in English. She felt terrible afterward and said, "Mrs. Graham, I froze. I couldn't even say simple sentences." I looked at her and said, "Maria, this is your chance to connect with people. Next time, don't worry about being perfect. Just think about helping them." A week later, Maria came back with a different story. She said, "Mrs. Graham, it happened again. Another patient needed help, and this time I spoke to them in English. I made mistakes, but they understood me. They even smiled and said thank you." Maria's face lit up as she shared this moment. It was a turning point for her. She realized that English wasn't about perfection. It was about communication and connection. I gave Maria a new exercise. Think of real situations where you'll need English. Imagine you're explaining a medical procedure to a patient or talking to a doctor from another country. Practice these conversations out loud, even if no one is listening. Maria did this every day. She practiced in front of a mirror with her colleagues and even with her family at home. Slowly, she became more confident. A year later, Maria applied for a job at an international hospital. During her interview, she spoke English clearly and confidently, even when she didn't know every word. She got the job. Maria sent me a message afterward. "Mrs. Graham, I'm working with doctors and nurses from all over the world. Thank you for teaching me that persistence and connection are more important than perfection. I turned back to my students and said, Maria's story teaches us two things. First, persistence is the key to success. Don't give up, even when you fail. Second, English is not just a language, it's a way to connect with people. When you speak with purpose, you can overcome any challenge. After sharing Maria's story, I smiled at my students and said, I've told you how persistence and connection helped Maria succeed. But now, let me show you how she practiced. I taught her a few techniques that you can also use in your learning journey. 1, the imagine the situation technique. I asked Maria to imagine real-life situations where she would need English. Close your eyes, I told her. Picture yourself explaining a medical procedure to a patient who doesn't speak your language. What would you say? How would you describe it in simple words? Maria hesitated at first, but with practice, she became better at visualizing and preparing her sentences. I turned to my class and said, You can do this too. Think of situations where you need English at work, when traveling, or even ordering food at a restaurant. Imagine yourself speaking confidently and practice the words you would use. 2, shadow speaking practice. Maria struggled with pronunciation, so I introduced her to shadow speaking. I played short medical videos in English and asked her to repeat the sentences immediately after hearing them. It's like being an echo, I explained. You don't need to understand every word. Just focus on the rhythm and sound of the language. At first, Maria found it difficult, but soon she could mimic the way native speakers spoke. Her confidence grew as her pronunciation improved. 3, the talk to yourself method. When Maria didn't have anyone to practice with, I encouraged her to talk to herself. Describe what you're doing in English, I said. For example, if you're cooking, say, I'm cutting vegetables. Now, I'm adding spices. Maria laughed at the idea, but tried it anyway. She later told me, Mrs. Graham, I didn't realize how much this would help. I'm thinking in English more often now. 4, build vocabulary through stories. Maria needed to learn medical terms, so I helped her create stories using these words. For example, I told her, imagine you're treating a patient named Mr. Hart who has a problem with his arteries. Create a story about how you help him. Maria loved this exercise. It's like playing a game, she said. I remember the words better when they're part of a story. I looked at my class and said, You can try this too. Pick new words and create a story around them. It makes learning fun and helps you remember better. 5, record and reflect. Another technique I gave Maria was to record herself speaking English. I told her, listen to your recordings. You'll notice your mistakes and improve. Maria was shy at first, but she soon realized how helpful this was. It's like seeing myself in a mirror, she said. I can hear where I need to improve. 6, celebrate small wins. Maria often felt discouraged by her mistakes. I told her, focus on your progress, not your perfection. Every small step counts. Whenever Maria used English successfully, even in small ways, I encouraged her to celebrate. You helped a patient today? That's a big win. After explaining these techniques, I said to my students, these methods worked for Maria, and they can work for you too. The key is to practice every day, stay patient, and believe in yourself. Remember, learning a language is like climbing a mountain. Every small step takes you closer to the top. As I looked at my students, I knew they were ready for the final lesson. I smiled and said, Maria's story teaches us 3 important things. Admit that you don't know everything. When we accept that we don't know it all, we open ourselves to learning more. Aria realized this during his interview and used it to improve. Don't let pride stop you from growing. Be persistent and learn from failure. Failure is not the end. It's a chance to grow. Like Maria, you will face challenges, but each failure teaches you something important. Don't give up. Keep going, and you will improve with every mistake. Learn from children. Children don't worry about making mistakes when they learn. They speak from their hearts. You can do the same with English. Speak with confidence, even if you make mistakes. The key is to keep practicing and believe that you can improve every day. If you remember these 3 things, being open to learning, staying persistent, and speaking from your heart, you will succeed in learning English just like Maria. Keep believing in yourself and never stop trying. Every step you take brings you closer to your goal. With that, I gave a final encouraging smile and said, remember, the journey may be long, but you're not alone. Keep learning, keep growing, and keep moving forward.